Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started pretty soon, but as you log in, please put your name and any notes you want to make into the chat box. Welcome. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Aloha mai kako. Welcome to today's online seminar. This is the second of two seminars that we're holding on the purpose, procedures, and best practices for consultation under federal projects that affect historic properties. So I want to say welcome back to those who attended the first class in October, and a warm aloha to those who are joining us for the first time. The recording of part one of the seminar is available on Historic Hawaii Foundation's website, which is historichawaii.org. and also on the Historic Hawaii YouTube channel. So those who want to catch up or have a refresher, you can go back and watch that recording. Today's session is also being recorded, and we will add that to both the website and the YouTube channel shortly after the class ends. This presentation is a co-production with several partners. I am Kirsten Faulkner, Executive Director of Historic Hawaii Foundation. This class is also supported by our Education Program Manager, Andrea Nando-Scar, with additional technical support by Michelle Kizik, our Development Assistant. The Historic Hawaii Foundation is a statewide nonprofit organization that helps people save historic places. We're offering this class in conjunction and partnership with the National Park Service. We're joined by Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo, who is the Preservation Partnerships and History Program Manager for the National Park Service's region that includes Hawaii. She's joining us from California. And then later in our program, we will be joined by Laura Schuster, who is Cultural Resources Manager at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. Laura will present the case study and also be part of our panel discussion, and she is joining us from Volcano on Hawaii Island. Stanton Enomoto is the Senior Program Director for the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations at the U.S. Department of the Interior. He's joining us from Hawaii Kai on Oahu. The office was established by Congress in 2004 to help the Secretary of the Interior fulfill the responsibilities to Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian Homelands Trust. So we are grateful to be working with the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations on this program as well. For our panel discussion, we'll be joined by Dr. Susan Lebo, who is the Archaeology Branch Chief for the State Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Land and Natural Resources for the state of Hawaii, and she is joining us from her office in Kapolei on Oahu. And finally, our other panelists will be Mehealani Cipher, who is a director with the Ko'olaupoko Hawaiian Civic Club, who will be joining the panel discussion. Mehealani is joining us from Kaneohe on Oahu. And Ko'olaupoko Hawaiian Civic Club is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to perpetuating Native Hawaiian culture, advocating for care of Aina and Vai, and strengthening families and community on the windward side of Oahu. So welcome, Mehealani. This course was designed as a two-part training that presents the components of the National Historic Preservation Act, especially the process for consultation between federal agencies, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and local constituents, including Native Hawaiian organizations, to help resolve effects on historic properties that might occur from federal action. The goal of the class is to provide skill development and information that really helps with the engagement between government, nonprofit, business, and community interests, especially as they interact, consult, and work on projects and undertakings, so that together we can help identify properties of historic and cultural significance and consult to resolve adverse effects to those properties. This class is about 90 minutes. The first part back in October focused on the framework for the review process and the four-step process. We're not going to be repeating that, although we will be referring back to it. Instead, we're going to be focusing on consultation itself, the practice and advice, tips, best practices, and have a particular emphasis on consultation with Native Hawaiian organizations. We've divided the time roughly into four parts. The first portion is a presentation about consultation with strategies, tips, and best practices. The second section will take a local case study and explore how one federal agency is preparing for a robust consultation process. That case study will be followed by a panel discussion with our subject matter experts, and then the final section will respond to audience questions. Because this is a webinar and we're doing things virtually, we really wanted to provide alternative means for people to participate. So you can use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom controls and submit your questions that way. Submit those anytime during the presentations or any of the discussion, and when we get to the Q&A portion at the end, we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have. If we don't get to all the questions, we will be doing some written responses as well, and we can post those to our website later. And then during the presentation, we also have a few, we're calling them knowledge checks. These will be pop-up boxes on the screen, and we'll ask the participants to click on the best answer. So we'll give you a few minutes and then share those results. Those answers are aggregated, they're anonymous. We don't know how each individual responds, but the check-in will help us to know if the information is clear and helps us obviously to connect to our virtual audience, since you can see us, but we can't see you. So we're going to try that pop-up box with a general question first. This is multiple choice, so you can check all that apply. But we'd like you to indicate your primary interest in the Section 106 process. So are you representing or affiliated with a Native Hawaiian organization, a federal agency, a state or local government, community or preservation organization, a preservation professional, such as a contractor, archaeologist, architect, historian, so forth? Do you have a public or community interest, or are you an applicant for federal licensing, permitting, or funding? So the pop-up box is on your screen. You can pick as many as you think describe you and your role. And then once Andrea sees some critical mass, she'll share the results with us. All right, let's see what the answers are. All right, really good mix. This is a nice mix of everybody, really. So about 13% are Native Hawaiian organizations, 36%, about a third, are from federal agencies, and another 23% for state and local government. So it looks like about half of our audience actually are responsible for implementing the 106 process. And the other half are community and preservation organizations, professional contractors, community and public interest, and just a couple who are applicants. So that's excellent. Thank you all. And welcome. I hope there's something for everyone in this process. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Stanton Enomoto, our Office of Native Hawaiian Relations, and he's going to give us the overview and take it from here. So Stanton, thank you.
Mahalo, Kirsten. Aloha mai kako, everyone. Thanks for calling in or tuning into this webinar. For my section of our slide presentation, I'm going to kind of walk through a few things, talk about some overview of the National Historic Preservation Act, then get into some strategies even before 106 starts. What are some things agencies can think about, and what are some things Native Hawaiian organizations can think about, and then get into the actual steps. For those that were on our call in October might recall maybe the next slide, we'll get into that 4-step process. You know, National Historic Preservation Act was created in 1966. It carved out, or it created the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. It carved out a role for this idea of consultation on federal projects that potentially adversely affect historic properties. So this process is, again, 4 steps. It's the start of the process. It gets into the identification of historic properties that may be within that area of potential effect. And I'll kind of review some of these things as we go forward. And then it's assessing the effects of the undertaking on those historic properties. And then really thinking about, well, you know, through consultation, how do we address those effects? So as you see on the left side, consultation runs throughout the process. There are, as you see on the right side, opportunities for the process to end should there not be historic properties, or should those properties not be affected, et cetera. Going through the full process, it ends with an agreement, again, through consultation, whether it's a MOA or a memorandum of agreement, or a PA or a programmatic agreement. And I'll touch on this briefly. For those that want more detail, again, I think we covered a lot of that in the October webinar. So next slide. Let's kind of just review real quickly what consultation is. And, you know, it's kind of self-intuitive. It's a process of engagement, of interaction, of seeking, as you see, you know, having these conversations about a particular undertaking, understanding what's going on, and then should there be adverse effects, trying to work through this process of reaching agreement. Again, it's very focused towards the avoiding adverse effects to historic properties. And you see up on the top the federal regulation 36 CFR Part 800 that implements the National Historic Preservation Act. So I'll be getting more into this as we go forward. So next slide. For federal agencies, you know, it's really important as they initiate these undertakings. They're responsible for implementing Section 106. So they're required by federal regulations and law to consult with the State Historic Preservation Division, other consulting parties, including Native Hawaiian Organizations. And again, it's this process of reviewing that undertaking and looking at its potential to adversely affect properties that are on the National Register or eligible, and then how to go about avoiding, mitigating, or minimizing those impacts. Okay, next slide. Native Hawaiian organizations come into this process as having that opportunity to advocate for their interests, whether they identify properties that are of religious or cultural significance to them. Federal agencies are required to take in that input and consider that input. They can't dismiss it out of hand, and they're required to reach out and actually engage Native Hawaiian organizations in that process. Again, I'll touch on more of this as we go forward. So for Native Hawaiians, in 1992, the National Historic Preservation Act was amended to give greater definition to the role of Native Americans, whether it's Indian tribes, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians. And it called out specifically that properties that Native Hawaiian organizations ascribe a religious or cultural significance to, they may be eligible to the National Register. And again, it also required federal agencies to consult with these Native Hawaiian organizations on effects that an undertaking may have. So next slide. In addition to that, the National Historic Preservation Act and the regulations created some definitions for what a Native Hawaiian organization means. Basically, it's an organization that serves the interests of Native Hawaiians. It provides services to Native Hawaiians, and they have expertise on preservation on sites that are significant to Native Hawaiians. In federal law, there's a couple different definitions for Native Hawaiian organization, again, depending on the law, but these are the broad strokes and at least how it's defined in the National Historic Preservation Act. Pretty consistent throughout federal law is the definition for Native Hawaiians, meaning anyone who descends from the Aboriginal people who were here in the islands prior to 1778. So you'll note this definition is different than the definition of Native Hawaiian under the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, which has a blood quantum. So this is a definition that's much broader. And then just some of the graphics here of various Native Hawaiian organizations as an example. Yeah. So next slide. So some things to think about, whether you're a federal agency, government agency, or a Native Hawaiian organization, even before you start entering into the Section 106 consultation. So I'll try and cover it from both sides of the coin, if you will. So next slide. So from an agency perspective, a government agent, federal, state, if you are triggered by Section 106, it's really important, we feel that at the outset, to be able to provide that kind of appropriate and relevant information to all of the consulting parties, and doing it in such a way that the content of the information, the quality, it's clear, it's complete, and it's timely. There's kind of this thought that consult early and often. And for agencies, the more they outreach to the community, to Native Hawaiian organizations or others, and inform them of what's going on, it just makes that whole Section 106 process that much clearer when you actually get into. It also allows, agencies to kind of manage unrealistic expectations. So it's, be open, be transparent, be communicative as soon as you can. So anyway, some thoughts there. Next slide. It's also important for agencies to be mindful of the process, the 4 steps we touched on back in October and what you saw on the slide earlier. You really have to take them sequentially. It doesn't help an agency, or at least we don't think it helps consultation, if at the outset, for example, an agency may propose a draft agreement document to a Native Hawaiian organization. It just tends to short circuit that process, and it doesn't lend itself very well. So I think you want to work through those 4 steps, start broad, work down to the very issues, and then create that draft agreement accordingly. So next slide. Again, it just really is important to follow that 4-step process of initiating the process, identifying the sites, assessing the adverse impacts, and then figuring out how we're going to deal with that through consultation. So following those 4 steps are really key, and being transparent and consistent throughout that process. Again, starting broad and working your way down through that process. For Native Hawaiian organizations, I think there's some strategies as your organization may engage in that process. It's really important to make your organization known. My office maintains a list of Native Hawaiian organizations. We have about 100 or so, a little over 100 on that list right now. It's easy to register with our office, and that lets federal government, state government, other know who you are. And when they need to consult, the list is there. It's also important to establish relationships with those government agencies. Even if you're not on our list, you know who your neighbors are, whether it's, a national park or, Department of Transportation or whomever. It's important to know who those agencies are, who the staff are, and start having that conversation about the work that you do. It's really important to start building that relationship before consultation occurs. Next slide. A couple other strategies for those Native Hawaiian organizations that especially have kuleana over a particular area or a number of sites. It's important to know what resources you have, what your sites are, map them out in some way or have that knowledge. It's also important to have a management plan or a strategy that lets you communicate that, hey, this is who we are, this is what we do, these are the resources that we serve. A third area of importance is to really be kind of aware of what's going on around your area, either through government notices, public notices in the newspaper. You can even, on Google, sign up for e-alerts with keyword searches that, may affect your area. So it's important to be looking out and not just looking in. Yeah. Okay, I think next slide. We're at our first knowledge check. I'll read through it. So a federal agency is preparing for a Section 106 consultation. So happens a member of the agency staff is Native Hawaiian. The agency's project manager can use discussions about the undertaking with that staff member to satisfy the requirement to consult with Native Hawaiian organizations. True or false? What do you folks think? Give you a minute. Okay, right on. Yeah, looks like pretty much everyone hit it on the head. So that's awesome. Yeah. A project manager talking to their staff who just happens to be Native Hawaiian, that doesn't check the box. That agency needs to reach out to the broader community, needs to let NHOs know and give them the opportunity to participate in that consultation process. So yeah, that's that. Let's move on into some strategies during the actual 4-step process. So I'll be covering the first 2 steps, and then I'll be passing it to Elaine to cover the 3rd and 4th steps. So starting out, again, if you remember from that graphic, initiating that Section 106 process, the federal agency has a responsibility to identify their action as an undertaking, and they're required to reach out to various consulting parties. And you can see the list there, whether it's the State Historic Preservation Division, Native Hawaiian Organizations, or others, the public, etc., even the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. But it's important to know that it's the federal agency that initiates this process. Okay, next slide. So some strategies to be mindful of for Native Hawaiian organizations in this first step. It's really, you want to be prepared to respond. And this goes back to some of the things I talked about earlier, of having this management plan or strategy, or having an understanding of the sites that are important to your organization. Be ready. So you have all of that stuff set. Another thing to really pay attention to is the scope and what's called the area of potential effect, or APE, of that undertaking. You see here in the example, there was a project up on Kauai and a highway repair project. So it involved, designating that particular area and the scope of the work. So as a Native Hawaiian organization, you can look at that and start saying, yeah, there may be project or sites of concern to us that are in this APE, and you know how to respond. So you'll see things in public notices in the newspaper or other government notices. Yeah. Next slide. A couple other strategies I think to be mindful of in this early stage is really, again, the more you know the resources that you're concerned about, the better able you will be to determine if they're going to be affected by a particular undertaking. And another thing to be aware of is, you know, Section 106 specifically deals with historic properties, whether they're on the National Register or eligible for the National Register. Section 106 is not a referendum on the actual project or undertaking itself. It does not give consulting parties this veto authority over, well, I don't like that highway, or I don't like that whatever bridge or something. Section 106 is about consulting on the impacts to historic properties. So I think it's really important to understand that, and again, manage expectations. So next slide. As we move into the step 2, so a federal agency has identified there's an undertaking, it mapped out the area of potential effect. We move into the second stage of looking at what historic properties could be affected. And again, this is a responsibility that the federal agency has to do to identify those things. And it's done not only through their resources, but through consultation. They may not see things that the SHPO knows or that Native Hawaiian organizations know or other consulting parties. So we'll dig into this a little bit deeper and yeah, some strategies. So next slide. One of the things the National Historic Preservation Act and its regulations recognize is this notion of special expertise. It really does afford Native Hawaiian organizations this opportunity to identify those properties of cultural and religious significance to them. And it requires that the federal agency consult with them about it. It does not give that federal agency the ability to kind of dismiss or to deny such a request or anything like that. They're required to reach out to Native Hawaiian organizations and consult them. So yeah, it's a pretty strong provision in the regulations, and it behooves Native Hawaiian organization to come forward and share that information with the federal agency if there is some potential effect. They're obligated to consider that information that's provided to them. Okay. Next slide. So some things to think about, you know, oftentimes a federal agency may contract with a cultural resource firm or whomever to do that assessment for them or help them with that assessment. So some of the things that a cultural professional might see could be, for example, this is a make-believe example is, a habitation site. There could be midden scatters or stone structure. Obviously, we see a trail here, so they'll map out the trail, identify what it looks like, its features, etc. And perhaps there's, a petroglyph field that they notice and again, map out. And I'm not trying to diminish what cultural resource professionals look at, but sometimes this is, the view and the lens through which they come at these things. However, through the special expertise of Native Hawaiians, they may see things a little bit differently. For example, they may see a wahipana in this area where it's a landform or it's something in the geology of the area that's tied to traditions. They may see, other things that are associated with the trail, that it's not just a physical trail, but it connects to all of these stories and traditions and history that make it much more richer. They may see things like an Ankyllium pond, which for an archaeologist may not bring up much, but there could be traditions and religious significance associated with that. There could, for example, be burials out there that they know about that other people don't know about. And this is a really sensitive issue, you know. Or there could be petroglyphs that have also traditional and cultural significance to it. So it takes both sides to see this landscape in its fullness and take that into account when looking at identifying sites. So next slide. So there's a provision within the National Historic Preservation Act that provides for confidentiality, you know, especially around things like perhaps burials where nobody wants to see them disturbed, but it's important to make that agency aware of it. So I just, you know, we're showing you these slides just to let you know there are provisions in the law that provide for disclosure or withholding of disclosure of information, whether it's location, character, or ownership. If there's these instances of risk of harm or, you know, impeding cultural practices associated with a particular site. So next slide, carrying it a little bit further, by character, we mean, you know, it's looking at its physical features, setting, age, contents, etc. Ownership in some instances can also be important to withhold. If by providing that, it makes it much easier to locate the property, yeah, that's something that can be withheld. Also, protecting information is not just limited to text, but it also includes maps, pictures, you know, other forms of media or images. So it's important, I think, for NHOs to know that, yeah, sensitive information can be held confidential. So it's a possibility. Next slide. So getting into some of these strategies, here it's more for Native Hawaiian organizations. I think it's really important to be able to communicate effectively. A lot of times government agencies work within the language that they have within, you know, federal law and regulations. So to the extent that an NHO can communicate using that same terminology, makes it that much more effective in getting their message across. It's also important to be really timely about meeting submission deadlines. Federal agencies aren't required to take in comments after deadlines or extend deadlines. So it's really important to pay attention to that. It's also important to be mindful on these projects that are really large or complex or cover a very broad area. There can be multiple consulting parties. And sometimes those parties may have different agendas or they may not fully line up with each other. So sometimes it's helpful to have these sidebar conversations amongst the consulting parties to get to know each other and understand what people are working towards. So yeah, things to be mindful of. Next slide. And here we are at our third knowledge check. So again, I'll read this out. Federal agency hires an archaeologist to identify properties that meet the criteria for listing on the National Register. The archaeology reports states that while there are few features in the APE, the area was previously disturbed and the features have lost historic integrity and no longer eligible for listing. Can the agency proceed with the undertaking confident that no historic properties will be affected? True or false? All right, very good, very good. And a lot of you, yeah, got the right answer. The answer is false. You know, federal agencies, even though they take input from an archaeologist or see that report, like that example that I showed you earlier, they still need to consult with Native Hawaiian organizations. And it's possible that an NHO may see things that the archaeologist didn't. So again, they have to go through this process of reaching out and consulting to try to identify those properties of religious and cultural significance. So at this point, I will turn it over to Elaine, who's going to pick up steps 3 and 4. Mahalo.
Good morning, everyone. As Stanton said, we'll cover steps 3 and 4 and the strategies for participating and consulting during these steps. Step 3 is assessing the effects on historic properties. Sorry, my video went out. The federal agency has, after the historic properties have been identified, the agency has to determine whether those properties will be affected by the project and whether that those effects would be adverse. And in accordance with the regulations, the agency is required to assess these effects in consultation with the SHPO and any NHO, Native Alaskan or Indian tribe that attaches religious or cultural significance to any identified historic property. Note that there, as Stanton, and some of the other steps, as Stanton mentioned, that there are timeframes at certain points in this step. So responding within those timeframes is critical to ensure that your comments are considered. Adverse effects are those that diminish the characteristics of that property that qualify it for inclusion on the National Register. Some of the strategies for consulting during the assessments of effect, Stanton had mentioned previously, as far as prep, is to have a management plan. And one of the reasons why a management plan or a strategic plan or other types of plans can be very helpful is that, clearly communicating the effects of the undertaking on the historic properties of importance to NHOs is essential. Having that prepared plan, you have it, it describes how the NHO interacts with the property and will help the federal agency, SHPO, and if necessary, ACHP better understand how the undertaking may pose adverse effects. The plan for Kanaloa explains the ways in which Kanaloa exists and is experienced, and it outlines a collective effort to protect and nurture Kanaloa in all forms. And so that information would be beneficial in a consultation. Also, you want to be proactive. Make sure that any of the language that the federal agency uses, any of the federal language that the federal agency uses documenting the effects is representative of the NHO's views. Utilizing accurate terminology and traditional Hawaiian place names is key to characterizing the unique resources that are affiliated with NHOs. Also, strategy, sometimes there are disagreements and a need for appeal, and keeping records and documenting the consultation can make an NHO prepared to accurately document the disagreement to the federal agency, SHPO, and ACHP. Step 4, after the agency has assessed the effects, and if there are adverse effects, the agency then needs to consult with the SHPD, NHOs, and other consulting parties and work to reach agreement on how to resolve those adverse effects. And the resolution, you're looking for, the agency is responsible to develop and evaluate measures or alternatives or modifications to the project that could avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. And it aims to reach agreement with the consulting parties, the SHPO and ACHP and NHOs. Agreement on the resolution, is usually documented in an agreement document, an MOA, or a programmatic agreement. One thing to keep in mind in this part of the consultation, the Section 106 process, is that the regulations do not impose time frames on this part of the process, unlike the previous steps. Some of the strategies for consulting on resolution of effects, it's good to have potentially prioritize the resolution of the actions or the NHOs in developing ideas or proposing actions that might avoid, minimize, or ways to mitigate an adverse effect. It's really helpful to prioritize which actions provide the best outcomes for the historic properties of religious and cultural significance to them. While avoidance may be your goal, if avoidance is not possible, it will be helpful or desirable to identify ways to minimize impacts or to identify mitigation measures that are appropriate for the nature and significance of that historic property. You also want to engage in dialogue. Obviously, you want to be respectful, but also, consultation to resolve adverse effects really involves discussion about the effects to the historic properties and the ways to minimize them, avoid them, or to mitigate them. And the federal agency is required to consider the options of avoidance and minimization. And I think Stanton hit on this point earlier that, be aware that if that federal agency should be looking to avoid and minimize the properties before jumping to mitigating those effects. If adverse effects can't be avoided or minimized, then the federal agency seeks other ways to mitigate those effects to the historic properties only after trying to avoid and minimize. And NHOs should articulate what is considered to be adequate mitigation for historic property, including those of religious and cultural significance to NHOs. The ACHP and SHIP-D will consider NHO views regarding appropriate mitigation. And, mitigation is ultimately determined by the federal agency, but it doesn't have to occur within the footprint of the project, but it really should be designed to offset the impacts resulting from the adverse effect that may harm those specific historic properties. As such, articulating the significance and integrity is key, as we know, to determining a site, whether a site is historic or a property is historic, but also in determining what might constitute adequate mitigation. If the NHO feels that the agency's mitigation proposals are inadequate to address the adverse effects to the historic properties of religious and cultural significance to it, the NHO should be prepared to articulate why the property is significant and the characteristics of the property connected to that significance. You also want to have clarity. Insist that the language within a PA or an MOA is clear and understandable. This may mean that you have to read, a few drafts and, reread sections that you've read previously. You just want to make sure that that information is clear. Also, you want to monitor the process. In other words, during the consultation, keep track of the draft agreement documents and the agreed upon actions so that they are recorded accurately in that PA or MOA. I think it's time for another knowledge check. I will read this. The federal agency is developing an MOA to resolve effects. A stipulation reads, an archaeological monitoring program shall be submitted to SHIP-D for review and approval prior to implementation. This stipulation is sufficient to address effects from ground disturbing activities, true or false. Great. We have a high level of success in answering this question. The answer is false. The stipulation that the stipulation as it was written in this question really didn't provide enough information. The stipulation really needed to answer, who is going to do what, when are they going to do it, which standards are they going to use, and how will it be evaluated or completed. Often one way to kind of test a stipulation is to see whether or not the active voice is being used. So now we're going to look at some of the strategies for post-agreement. Section 106 consultation does not necessarily end with the execution of an MOA at the point that there's an execution of an MOA or a programmatic agreement. Section 106 regulations provide that signatories to an MOA or PA may agree to stipulations regarding discovery of previously unidentified historic properties or unanticipated effects to historic properties during the implementation of the undertaking. When those stipulations are included in an agreement, they will often provide for the stoppage of work, notification of the signatories or other concurring parties, consultation on assessing the historic property or mitigation of the adverse effect, a decision document, and a process for implementing any corrective actions. In an instance where an MOA or a PA lacks such a stipulation and historic properties are discovered or unanticipated effects on historic properties are found, the Section 106 regulations require that an agency take all responsible efforts to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those adverse effects. I think we're one slide ahead. I'll move on. Strategies for consulting during implementation of a project. Be prepared for the duration of the undertaking. The PA, in some ways marks the most important, or MOA marks the most important, the beginning of a phase, and that's the implementation of the undertaking. Depending on the nature of the undertaking, these activities can last many years. For example, the Kui'imanu road widening project on Hawaii Island and the Honolulu Area Rapid Transit Project on Oahu have been ongoing for over a decade. And NHOs, they may need to be prepared to monitor the federal undertakings and engage the parties of the programmatic agreement for many years. And as Stanton had mentioned, developing relationships, and having previously developed those relationships, these parties can be beneficial in building trust and resolving conflicts during the project. Seeking clarification from the federal agency about the status of an MOA or PA implementation can be important. NHOs and other preservation organizations that are parties to the agreement are frequently the parties that are following or monitoring the terms of the agreement. So consequently, it's very important that, but not, even though the NHOs are not obligated to do so, to not only be aware of that the work is being conducted, but also to schedule project status meetings if they aren't part of the regular, if they haven't already been established by the agency, and to be clear in holding the parties accountable to the agreement. Also document, keeping a copy of the documents sent by the federal agency, as well as any other correspondence, telephone conversations, meeting notes, discussions with, the SHPD or ACHP, allows NHOs to maintain an accurate record of their involvement in the Section 106 process for a specific undertaking. This documentation can be very valuable in the event a dispute does arise during the implementation of the undertaking. And it also can serve as a guidance and possible template for future consultation. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Laura Schuster.
Good morning. I'm struggling with the keys here. Good morning. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our very big collapse at the summit of Kilauea. So let me begin here. On April 30th and continuing through August 4th, 2018, the park, the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and specifically Kilauea Summit caldera underwent major physical change. As magma drained from the beneath Halemaumau crater, the magma movement triggered in excess of 60,000 earthquakes. 4,400 of those earthquakes were magnitude 3 and higher. The largest earthquake that we felt on the island during that period was 6.9 magnitude on May 4th. So we had a combination of earthquakes, clouds of rock and ash were blown into the air across the landscape. And the following video exemplifies one of those larger earthquakes. It was recorded by HVO on July 5th, 2018. The seismic activity significantly impacted buildings in the immediate vicinity of Ue Kahuna Bluff, including the National Park Service managed Jagger Museum, which is, you can see the large parking lot, the very small building at the first, and then the pathway there. The first small building are the restrooms. The longer building right there is what's called the annex or the geochemical building. And then the building just towards you as a screen viewer is the Jagger Museum. The longer building at the back there with a tower, that is called the Okamura building. So the seismic activity significantly impacted these buildings and the landscape feature there, that large viewing platform at the summit. And Jagger Museum, USGS Hawaii Volcano Observatory buildings, and Reginald Okamura building, the geochemical building. Monitoring equipment that had been laid out across the volcano and access roads to the summit area were significantly damaged over that 3-month period of activity that resulted in the closure of the park. The 2018 eruption and caldera collapse were the most destructive eruptive events in Hawaii in the last 2 centuries. And here are a few statistics. 13.7 square miles of land was inundated by lava. Sometimes the thickness is 30 to 80 feet in places. 875 acres of new land was created by ocean entries. 1 billion cubic yards of lava erupted, enough to fill at least 320,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So there was a lot going on. An initial post-disaster assessment conducted in October 2018 of the summit area buildings found that the significant investment would be necessary to correct the damage to the Jagger Museum, Okamura building, and others. Neither was deemed safe to occupy. and such investment would be compromised by the continued ground movement in the area. The Jagger HVO complex is surrounded by cracks and active faults, and the area continues to subside on the crater side due to the caldera collapse, undermining slope stability and building foundations. So consequently, the removal of the buildings at the summit triggered the need to identify cultural resources that may be adversely affected by the removal of the damaged buildings. The National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106, began. So the summit, next slide, please. Oh, actually, let's see, yes, yeah, next, is that 52? No, just stay right there, thanks. Oh, 52, actually, the slide, next slide, thank you. So the summit in Kilauea area, specifically Halemaumau, is as a primary landscape associated with Pelehanuamea. Among other landscapes within the park, it is recognized as a traditional cultural property to which Native Hawaiians attach religious and cultural significance, and it remains significant today through active cultural practices. Planning for replacement structures at the summit must consider this as well as other cultural assessments that are needed to document resources that may be determinations that may be made by determinations of eligibility for inclusion on the National Register. And then next slide, please. Within the summit area of the park, Kilauea Crater, the 1877 Volcano House, and the Whitney Vault are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Several structures, landscapes, and sites either on the Hawaii Register of Historic Places or have been determined eligible and included on one of these registers. Crater Rim Drive is one of those properties, and is associated with the historic district that identifies Jagger Museum as a contributing property. Uekahuna is an area of geologic, natural, and cultural significance and is identified in the 1972 National Register nomination for the Kilauea Crater. Next slide, please. Planning for removal of the buildings was not a new idea, but for the park. During a previous planning process for a general management plan in 2016, the current buildings were to be, if they were to be damaged by a volcanic event, their removal from the summit would be considered. The park would not encourage replacement of the facilities in the effort to reduce building on the summit. For the current planning effort, the NPS and the U.S. Geological Survey met to develop design concepts for replacement of lost workspace and exhibit space elsewhere in the park. Thank you. The intent of the current project is to repair and or replace critical park infrastructure and USGS operated facilities and equipment damaged during that 2018 eruption, the summit collapse, Kilauea volcano. The project addresses potential future use of Uekahuna Bluff, but not with structures. So these are some of the concepts that were developed and also shared with the public. And the park had taken the lead with this planning effort. And in May of 2020, the concepts were jointly developed with USGS and NPS, and were communicated to the public through a various means, either online through our project review and compliance portal, or intended to be part of what we understand to be civic engagement. So the National Park Service defines civic engagement as a continuous dynamic conversation with the public on many levels that reinforces public commitment to the preservation of heritage resources, both cultural and natural, and strengthens public understanding of the full meaning and contemporary relevance of these resources. The foundation of civic engagement is a commitment to building and sustaining relationships with the neighbors and communities of interest. The park received 159 responses, with 140 of those responses specific to concepts that were shared with the public. As a follow-up, the park shared the final report on the findings in September 2020, the Civic Engagement and Comment Analysis Report. summarizes the comments and communications received from 9 states and 78% of the Hawaii residents, and those of that did respond from Hawaii was about 78%. So the results are available online, and I will share that link with Kirsten and HHF after this presentation. Thank you.
Great. We're now going to have a discussion. You can call it a roundtable or a panel discussion with Laura Stanton and Mehelani Cipher and Susan Lebo, whom Kirsten introduced at the beginning of the presentation. Susan, if you can hear us, you're still not visible. There we go. Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask some questions, and maybe not everybody will be able to answer every question, but I think it'll help kind of tie some things together. So the first question I have, well, actually, I'll start with the statement. So, earlier in the presentation, Stanton discussed the importance of relationship building. Let's assume that everybody agrees that that's an important and beneficial thing to do. And so the question that I have is, can you offer suggestions of ways to start building and maintaining these relationships? Mehelani, do you want to go first?
I can start first because I've been trying to do some of it. We like to meet with the heads of agencies, especially the DOT. That's been our longest running relationship. So every time a new director comes in, we try to make a point of visiting with them and explaining to them our concerns and try to find ways that we can work together going forward. And that has really worked with the Department of Transportation. They have been trying to, State Department of Transportation, they've been trying to work with us on various activities that we have ongoing. So meeting with the representatives of agencies top to bottom, even the line people that you have to work with every day, it's important to get to know them. So that's one of the things I suggest.
Stanton, did you want to say something?
I just had a quick thought too, and yeah, mahalo, Mehelani. Relationships are two sides of the coin, right? So as much as, I think we encourage Native Hawaiian organizations to get to know those agencies that they interact with, whether it's Department of Transportation, et cetera. I think it's also helpful for our federal agencies or state agencies, Department of Defense or others, to have kind of open houses, create these opportunities for the community to come in and get to know you. Not everyone, especially, on highway projects or other things, not everyone knows what's going on. So for a government agency to create this space to just, meet each other. I mean, if nothing else, it helps. It helps get people knowing each other. So when you do have to consult, it makes it hopefully a little bit easier.
So, right, and I can share with you what we have had in place at Hawaii Volcanoes, and that is we have what's called a kupuna group. And decades ago when I started working here in the park, it was really the sort of the Hawaiian group from within the park. So there were staff that we met and we talked about projects that were ongoing in the park. It became a much bigger group, and actually the staff, we realized that was a kind of an illegal issue with having the staff involved in our consultations. So we ended up reaching out to the public, and there were groups of individuals from both Kalapana, from the Ahupua'a that are on either side or that the park is part of, and that we reached out to the community, which we had quite some good ties with through staff. And we've had meetings, not necessarily just for consultation, but also just to kind of give an update of what the park is doing and in terms of the research projects that are going on in the park and that sort of thing, and to just engage with the public that way and with the Hawaiian communities specifically. So, but I will say that, you know, with the department, with the DOI list of DOI opportunities to engage with the Native Hawaiian organizations from, you know, around the islands, it's been difficult to engage individuals from those lists. And so I'm really open for suggestions on how to make that work better.
So I don't know if you can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So obviously before COVID, we often would hold meetings and have discussions or trainings regarding 106 and discussions about individual property projects. So now what we are looking for is virtual meetings where individuals or community or NHOs can reach out and we can start discussions about individual projects or individual sections of islands or resources that are of concern even before the project is officially introduced to SHPD for review. We also try to encourage and work with any agency that wants to initiate consultation very early in the process, who wants to help identifying who might want to consult. We maintain our own list of NHOs who have identified themselves, and oftentimes they are identified to a particular area or they want to consult on particular kinds of projects and so forth, so that we try and use that as a way to assist agencies as well as bringing together, matching those agencies and NHOs for those proposed projects.
Great. It sounds like there's kind of like a network of opportunity for agencies to connect and for NHOs to connect to the agencies. I have another question, which is, you know, we mentioned management plans, I think twice in the presentation or treatment plans, but not everybody has a treatment plan or a management plan. Can you make a few recommendations about how to communicate effectively about a cultural resource within the context of Section 106 consultation? You know, tips, pointers, especially if you don't have a management plan.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. You know, again, I think it's helpful to look at some of the existing guidance that the Advisory Council has put out on Section 106 consultation. It's helpful to read the regulation and understand what it means to have a site be eligible for inclusion on the National Register. I mean, there's all these kind of terms of art, but to the extent that, you know, an organization can avail themselves to that language, that helps in their communication during Section 106 consultation. You know, I get it. Not every NHO has, you know, the fiscal means to respond. Oftentimes they feel put upon by a particular undertaking and they're in a reactive mode. They may not have the financial resources to do it. You know, there are grant funding programs through National Park Service or through the Administration for Native Americans on the federal side. OHA even has funds available that can help support these small NHOs do the work that they need to do. So yeah, I get it. It's a challenge. And who knows, at some point there may be an interest in amending policy, but you know, that's another conversation well beyond me and my agency. But you know, that's always a possibility too, to have the government agency that's responsible for the undertaking if they're setting aside resources for contracting an archaeology firm, why can't they set aside funds to support an NHO or a consulting party in consultation? You know, again, it's just a thought out there.
Well, even for the agency too, I mean, the agencies really have a hard time, you know, getting all of their resources documented. And I think, you know, for working with the NHOs and also with the State Historic Preservation Office, I mean, that really, it's really vitally important for, say, for example, I'm at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, but for park units to really have what we call sort of the primary documents for your park. And you know, from a cultural resource perspective, it is, you know, understanding what your landscape, your cultural landscapes are, your traditional cultural properties are, and having those sort of baseline documents done. But it is difficult for even the Park Service to get some of those things done. And just as an example, this particular program, you know, although the park is well over 100 years now old, but the cultural resource end of things really didn't really form until about 1994 as a division or a program in the park. So, you know, some of us are catching up on trying to do that. And so it does take time. It is for the long haul, definitely. And as the State Historic Preservation Office, the work that they do is really vital to maintain all of the work and support of the work that we do in you know, as a federal agency. And it would be the same for other federal agencies too, I would imagine.
So I would comment on three things that the speakers had mentioned. Language, being able to effectively understand and make use of the regulatory language. If you speak that federal speak, then the federal agency has a better chance to understand that you are working on the communicating in the same way. Looking at the characteristics of the cultural resource or historic property, it's so critical to be able to effectively communicate what are the critical character defining features. To be able to, it's not enough to say this particular channel is a wahipana. You have to be able to say something about what are the character defining features, because without that, you're not going to get the federal agency to agree that there is an adverse effect.
Good point. She'll make it good.
Yeah, you really need to be able to say, okay, yes, it's a wahipana, and you may not have to tell them all the reasons why it is or how it is. But it's important to say, here are the character defining features that we want you to take into consideration. And then here's why we think your project has an adverse effect. Because I think that's the biggest challenge that federal agencies have, is they may agree that this may be a significant resource. They may agree that it's a traditional cultural property, for example, but then they don't know how to say the project is going to have an adverse effect, and if it is, how to mitigate it, because they need to know what the characteristics are that are going to be impacted. So I think those are the three things that our agency tries to focus on, is helping people understand the language and working through the process with that foreign language of a federal speakeasy. And then really focusing on, you know, being able to identify your significant historic properties in a way that you can define the characteristics that you can then look at. Will there be an impact? And if so, is it an adverse impact? Because then to get to the next step of mitigating or avoiding, minimizing, or mitigating, you have to know what those characteristics are and be able to measure what that effect is.
And I'll just add too, is that, you know, a lot of us have never even, you know, gone through that process of an adverse effect, because we've been, you know, pretty diligent in getting either resources documented and communicating that. And but in this situation that we have currently in the park, you know, this is a pretty major one for us. So So any and all. So this is also, good training for me as well. So thank you.
Helena, did you want to add anything to that question?
If as a cultural practitioner and Native Hawaiian, it's challenging to deal with federal speak, because I know that decision makers and analysts need to see physical structures or features that help define the value of the site as a cultural site in whatever way. And Hawaiians sometimes, a lot of those features have been obliterated by, modern times, things that have changed over time. Haiku Valley, for example, the whole valley was changed by the development of a naval station there in the 1940s. So, how can you show the remnants of heiau that were there? And so Hawaiians think that the value of the sites are not just in the physical structure, but in the spiritual locations of these things. And so that's a little harder for agencies to handle and decide whether they can see that there's an adverse impact on the sites. So that's a challenge for Hawaiians, and it will continue to be for Native people everywhere.
Many, yeah, agreed.
Good point. Yeah.
I'll ask one more question, but we might not be able to have everyone answer it. Participation, as we saw in the presentations, participation in Section 106 consultation can demand a significant amount of time and commitment over a long duration of time. Can you recommend some strategies for managing participation to help ensure that an organization or an individual has the capacity to participate through to the end of the process and project?
Yeah, well, like I had talked about previously, in terms of being able to provide financial resources, there may be opportunities through, historic preservation grants that the National Park Service provides. There may be other grants through other agencies or state agencies. So there are some means. It may not be directly specific to Section 106. As the conversation was going on earlier, I was thinking about our professional community, those that work in the consulting fields, either for government agencies or to some extent Native Hawaiian organizations. It seems, as Susan mentioned, we're in this, there's a translation space, it seems, for maybe Native Hawaiian organizations as they identify these sites that are of importance to them. They're not sure on how to, translate it into the language that has meaning to the federal agency that gets it into this eligibility criteria for the National Register. There's several dots that need to be connected along the way. And there may be opportunities for our professional community to enter into that and provide assistance, whether it's pro bono or, whatever. So I think there's ways. And at the same time, I think an NHO also needs to avail themselves to this need. They gotta kind of communicate out there and say, hey, we steward this whatever area, we wanna understand, we wanna engage, we wanna work with, Hawaii Volcano or whomever, help us. Relationships are a two-way street. So I think from the agency side, you can only push so much. The community has to come from the other side and meet it halfway and have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think, for this particular issue that we're dealing with currently, I did, select some names, based on that information in the DOI list. And so, I'm not going to give up on them. They're going to get another letter soon,
Right.
That talks about our project, because I think it is a really important aspect of that community involvement. And for us I say the National Park Service, you know, its presence here on the island, and for us to engage in that that effort, you know, and it's not an onerous effort. It is part of our responsibility, you know, as we are a federal landowner, you know, or a steward of the land in Hawaii. So I think it's important. So
on our end, I think that we need to also look at changing how we do the conversation, how we do the consultation. So many times agencies simply send out a letter and then they're like, okay, I didn't get any responses. Okay, I'm done. And I found that for us, our most effective consultation, and we were not the agency, you know, we're not the federal agency, but we knew that the project was of considerable concern to the community, or it was a contentious project in terms of how the 106 had been conducted in the past or not. And that was, we engaged in talk story sessions. So what we did is, you know, the community came together, and we, on several of them, we actually did a site visit. We went and visited the places that the community said were important. And then we tried to have this listening session on our end, a talk story, to really try to understand how to translate what the community thought was important into this federal speak, such that we can communicate and advocate with respect to the consultation with the federal agency as to what needs to be taken into consideration. How can we look at these resources or ensure that the community is adequately being represented? In some cases, you may start out, we started out with a talk story event that lasted like 4 hours here at the SHPD office, and we had 10 or 12 people. And later the group got smaller, but all of the major concerns had been covered in the talk story event, such that a smaller number of people could continue the consultation through the process. And not everybody needed to be there. They could all be if they wanted and were available, but at least the information and the foundation was set by having these meetings.
Right, thank you. Mehalani, do you want to end this question in a minute or so?
Well, okay. I've been looking at the effects of a federal project on cultural resources since 1982. That's the Interstate H3. And an MOA was adopted and left the door open for further consultation. And the problem is they haven't really mitigated adequately any of the cultural resources that were identified. And so we are still in consultation.
Wow, amazing.
Since the 1980s.
Yeah, H3, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank the panel for answering the questions, and we wanted to leave a little bit of time so that we could take some questions from the participants, the audience. So thank you very much. And I think I'm turning it over to Kirsten.
Okay, you're welcome.
Kirsten? There we go.
You're muted.
You're muted.
There, is that right?
Yeah.
Yep, you're good.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. All right, so if a Native Hawaiian organization is aware of a site of cultural and religious significance, but is not permitted or is unwilling to share that location outside of their kind of need to know group, how can that be addressed in the 106 process? So maybe Stanton can take a stab at that, and then possibly Mehalani.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure what, what some of those barriers might be for that NHO to share that information. I presume they might have their own reasons for that. But that, I think in a Section 106 consultation, if in fact that cultural site lies within the APE and is potentially adversely affected, there's a risk there. Again, the National Historic Preservation Act provides confidentiality for sites that are sensitive. So there's ways in which to go about doing that. And maybe it does come back to kind of this notion of relationships. If they can actually trust the federal agency or the government agency with the information that they may provide. And if they don't, there's this risk. I'm not sure how to effectively kind of resolve that. I don't know, Mahealani, maybe you have some thoughts through your past experiences.
Well, I know that one of the traditional things that Hawaiians were very protective of was the location of burials. And up until the 1990s, nobody wanted a map to show where burials were located, because in ancient times, the EV was dug up and misused by enemies of the person who was buried. In modern times, some of us have considered identifying burials on a map just to make sure that it doesn't get inadvertently disturbed. So that's still a discussion going on among Native Hawaiian groups, not resolved yet. The other issue is there's a heiau on the windward side that was affected by H3, actually went through the middle of the heiau and had 1,000 burials there. And the caretaker of the site warned the state that there would be burials that would be disturbed, and nevertheless, the highway went through. The family of that caretaker wants to keep access and location of access private, because she doesn't want a lot of people going onto the site. The dilemma is that the burials are the remains of people from the whole community, not just that one family. So that's another discussion that hasn't been held. So even Native Hawaiians have things they have to work out.
Thank you both. Another question, and this was touched on a little bit earlier, but maybe talk about it more, but there's some inherent inequities within the process. The federal agency, the applicant for assistance, the hired consultants are all being paid to do this. This is their job. But the Native Hawaiian organizations are usually volunteers, except for maybe OHA. These are groups that are doing it with volunteer labor and on their own time. They're taking time off from work, or they're doing it, in their family time. What are some of the ways to address that inequity, or to help make everyone whole?
I was going to punt to my hair. I guess, like I mentioned earlier, the law and the regulations are written as they are. So while there's opportunity, there's not necessarily the sense of equality, especially for small Native Hawaiian organizations that, everyone's a volunteer. So I think that's understood. And, like I mentioned, there may be an opportunity there for amendments to policy as we go forward. But meanwhile, maybe there is this space for pro bono opportunities for the professional community to come in and provide assistance to these organizations that are, had this undertaking in effect thrust upon them that they're trying to deal with, and they're struggling for help. So maybe there's ways. There might be opportunities for some government agencies. Maybe this is something OHA might want to think about, being able to enter into that space and provide that capacity building.
So from an agency perspective, I would focus on two things: relationship building and documentation, as Elaine talked about earlier. Building those relationships with the agencies that are involved. So whether that's SHPD or some federal agency or whatever, building relationships such that you have that the things that are important to the NHO are expressed, and their other agencies have relationships such that they can continue to bring those concerns up as the process goes forward through that documentation. Because if you have documentation that these three sites or these historic properties or these concerns have been raised, then as an agency involved in the process, we have a responsibility to rely on those relationships and that documentation to come back and say, these things have been raised, they haven't been addressed. So you want to be able to hold not just the federal agency that's in whose project it is, but you want to hold you want the relationships with the other parties at the table to hold those concerns and considerations to be carried forward. So make sure that they're not discounted.
Just a point that I noticed that SHPD is very overwhelmed. They have so much work, and it's hard to really get their attention because they have a multitude of different projects that they have to get attention to. So while we want to build a relationship with SHPD, we know that SHPD is time challenged and staffing challenged. And we always try to advocate for them to get more funding and staffing because they're never having enough people to do all the work that they have. So that's at a local level, and SHPD is representing the feds at the local level. We think more resources need to go into that area as well.
We certainly
Thank
agree.
You, I also wanted to just note on the event page for this seminar, we also linked at Historic Hawaii Foundation to some kind of tips and best practices for Section 106. And there was one about having effective meetings. And part of that look was ways to ensure that people feel comfortable, they feel welcome, things like selecting what time. If you're doing this over the dinner hour, you need to provide dinner. If you're doing this at some remote location, you need to make sure that people have access. Maybe you help support travel stipends. If you want to include people with disabilities, maybe you need to make sure you're paying for their caretakers and the people that, their kupua. So I think there's some very practical things that can also help with engagement. So I would recommend people look at that too.
Yeah,
Sorry. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, right, we usually have done that. Just yesterday, we had our first Teams meeting with our consultation group, Kupuna. But for the most part, yeah, we usually will pick them up from wherever they are in, on the island. I mean, they're usually in either Puna or, Ka'u. So we'd end up picking them up and bringing them up to the park, and through our friends groups within the park, they would help us with the paying for lunch or some sort of food. So yeah, we try to do that. Absolutely important. So.
I'm going to have one final question. This is for Laura, but the question is, if there are traditional, cultural, and religious sites that are inside a locked gate, and if the sentries at the gate don't let people in for their traditional practices, how do you address that? Someone's going to Volcano and they want to go to Kilauea to engage in their practice, and the sentry says, no, you can't come in, or you have to pay $20 per car, or whatever. What's the remedy for that?
So for this park and for most national parks, if you are a native tribal member or a Native Hawaiian, and you say at the gate, you are here to practice your religious purposes, your practice, there should be no problem. You should be able to enter without a problem. If there is a lock gate at a point where For example, we did have something similar to that during our lockdown and when the park was closed. And it's really during that period of time, it was really much more of a safety issues. And we tried to accommodate when we could. But certainly we've had face-to-face conversations with individuals as well to direct them either to a place that may be safer than maybe the summit at the time during the explosive events. But traditionally the park is open to religious practices for Native Hawaiians.
Great, thank you. We're out of time, but before we go, I just wanted to let people know that we are planning to continue this virtual training kind of seminars in the first half of 2021. So you can watch for some upcoming notices. In January, we're going to be focusing on identification of historic properties and determining eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. So I know there were some questions around that. And then in March, we're planning on doing a session around standards and guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. So, you have a historic property, what's the best way to take care of it or to deal with issues around it? So that will be in March. And then in May, we're planning on having a session about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and the Hawaii Burial Protection Statute. So, there's been a lot of talk, I think, about cultural resources and burial protection that may or may not be part of 106, but definitely are covered under other laws. So those are the three that we're planning for the first half of 2021. You can learn about all of these by signing up for Historic Hawaii Foundation's e-newsletters, and there's a link on our website as well. And then finally, before we go, I wanted to let people know that there are a lot of additional resources that are put out by the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. And so on their website, which is achp.gov, you can find things like a handbook for Native Hawaiian consultation, and a policy statement on Advisory Council's interaction with Native Hawaiians. There's guidance for the NHOs themselves. There's some e-training, kind of on-demand training that's available, and these are free. So if you are interested in a deeper dive and getting more training on this, there's lots of resources too. And on Historic Hawaii's website, we will put up today's recording and presentation as well as links to some of these other references. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for your attention, especially want to thank our partners and our panelists for all of the work you do and for carving time out of your very busy schedules to be here with us today. So mahalo nui.
Aloha.